First tonight, President Trump has said that any country doing business with Iran will face an immediate 25% tariff on trade with the United States. The announcement on social media is his first clear move in response to Iran's deadly suppression of the protests, which have been raging for a fortnight, sparked initially by increasing economic hardships. At least 650 protesters have been killed, including 9 children, according to a Norway-based human rights group. President Trump has said he's considering a range of options, including military action, cyber attacks, widening sanctions, and providing satellite terminals to help protesters communicate. He's meeting his top advisors tonight, but Iran has been warning the U.S. not to intervene. The country's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, says Tehran is fully prepared for war, but is also ready for dialogue. And we'll have an assessment of the situation in Iran later in the program. In other news, 2 Democrat-controlled U.S. states, Minnesota and Illinois, are suing the Trump administration over the mass deployment of immigration agents. They've called the policy unconstitutional. In Minnesota, tensions remain high after the killing of 37-year-old Renee Good, which led to nationwide protests, and officials are demanding an end to what they describe as dangerous, illegal, and unconstitutional stops and arrests. They say communities have been terrorized through the use of tactics such as racial profiling, a claim the federal government denies. Their legal argument is that the government is involved in law enforcement activities in the states in ways that undermine their constitutional right to govern themselves. The Department of Homeland Security argues that the deployments are necessary to tackle illegal immigration and crime.
And we're here to announce a lawsuit we're filing against the United States Department of Homeland Security to end the unlawful, unprecedented surge of the federal law enforcement agents into Minnesota. Because this has to stop. The Constitution gives Minnesota the sovereign authority to protect health and well-being of every single person who lives on our borders. The Constitution gives us the right to vote for who we want, pray however we want, and be whoever we want, without fear of being racially profiled, assaulted, or killed in our own communities. We're going to defend those rights because as much as they like to believe it, DHS is not above the law, and the people of Minnesota are certainly not beneath it. The deployment of thousands of armed, mass DHS agents to Minnesota has done our state serious harm. This is, in essence, a federal invasion of the Twin Cities and Minnesota, and it must stop. And I wish I could stop there, but I can't, because these poorly trained, aggressive, and armed agents of the federal state have terrorized Minnesota with widespread unlawful conduct.
What we are seeing right now is not normal immigration enforcement. We are not asking ICE not to do ICE things. We are asking this federal government to stop the unconstitutional conduct that is invading our streets each and every day.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from New York by I.C.E special correspondent James Blue. Great to see you again, James. Just tell us more about why Minnesota and Illinois are taking legal action against the Trump administration's immigration policies.
Yeah, basically what they're trying to do is to rid the states of these sort of ICE agents who've come in to sort of exercise the Trump administration's desire to deport hundreds of thousands of people who are here illegally. I think the big issue is, as we've seen in Minnesota last week, is that it's causing conflict, and in the case of last week, it's cost lives. There were people shot last week in Oregon, and the legal argument is quite simple, that the jurisdiction, of course, ICE has the federal jurisdiction to execute these laws, However, there's no sort of coordination, there's no attempt to work with local officials, and there is sort of this hysteria and this sort of disorder that has resulted from these ICE raids. And so the argument is that it is causing more harm than good, and as a result, they should be stopped. I think it is a very difficult argument, but I do think what they're trying to do, the governors of both states, is to really assert what they can do to try to bring an end to these ICE raids, and that's why they've gone to court.
Well, I mean, you said it was a difficult case to try to make in court. Explain that a bit more to us, and in what ways they say the Trump administration's immigration policies are violating the 10th Amendment and other sort of constitutional provisions.
Well, I think it's not necessarily that the actual raids are violating the Constitution, but that the raids are actually causing disorder and public disruption, and therefore doing more harm than good. I think one of the big issues is the lack of coordination, the fact that they're not speaking to each other. The local law enforcement has no sort of indication of where these folks are going to turn up. And so one of the cases that they're making is that it is disruption of the public order as a result of these raids, and that's a price too high to pay.
And obviously there are two states going to court here. In the case of Minnesota, its lawsuit alleges widespread racial profiling by federal agents. Can you sort of elaborate on those claims?
Sure. I mean, basically, what they are suggesting is that they are looking at people and deciding to pick them up off the street simply based on how they look. Now, the problem is that used to be completely illegal, but a recent Supreme Court case that came through last year made that slightly more legal than it has been in the past. So if you look Hispanic, if you look like you're from Asia, if you look like you're from Africa, and you have the clothing and the accent and the other sort of attributes that might place you from that region, you can be stopped in some cases. And so that is one of the sort of constitutional arguments, that it is violating, sort of this principle that people cannot be judged based on what they look like or how they show up. And so I think that is for the case, as you mentioned, in Minnesota.
And I mean, what specific reliefs or actions or changes are they seeking from the court? So presumably these are contained in their lawsuit.
Well, I think one of the things that they would hope for, Charles, is that the court would make it a requirement that more has to be done in order to actually go and arrest people. One of the complaints from local authorities that there are no warrants, that they can show up just sort of willy-nilly. And generally, if you want to go and arrest and remove someone, the court has to issue a warrant. ICE has suggested that if there was a warrant process, that would sort of tip people off and they might go into hiding. One of the things that they've done, and which I think is particularly challenging, they are now picking people up after they come out of court. And that is, again, one of the ways in which it is quite, it's quite dangerous, because if you show up for court, if you're doing your civic duty, if you're trying to stay in the country legally, you show up for court thinking that you are going on the legal path, and then once you're in court and once you leave court, you can be arrested and deported.
And I mean, what might the broader implications and the potential consequences be of these lawsuits for immigration policy and federal-state relations across America?
Yeah, look, I think federal and state relations across the country are deteriorating, and it has everything to do with sort of the divide between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Red states who are supportive of President Trump are championing the efforts to round up the undocumented. Blue states, some of which are sanctuary states, which allow people who are undocumented to remain in place. The local authorities don't have to report them. Those states, which Wisconsin and I'm sorry, which Minnesota and Illinois are, those states are, really upset and quite agitated. The blue states are where many of the protests are happening. And so, Charles, it's just another place where the tension between the federal government and the local governments, between Republicans, Democrats, are completely on display. And, the hope is that there might be relief in the federal courts, but President Trump has appointed so many of the federal court judges. There was just a study release. They've sort of sided with him in about 92% of the cases that have had to be decided. Yes, there are those that have gotten through and that are not decided in the favor of the president and his administration, but the vast majority have been. So I think the prospect for these cases is quite small.
And James, you've told us quite a bit about the motivation, what's driving Minnesota and Illinois to go to court. But how is the Trump administration responding to all this, particularly claims that this is a politically motivated move by the Trump administration?
Yeah, in typical Trump administration factor, what they're doing is they are doubling down on the policy, sending more ICE agents to both Illinois and Minnesota. And this is in the face of the death last week, the investigation that's happening in Minnesota. And, I think there was some sense that there just needed to be a bit of breathing room. Yes, there were protests over the weekend and into yesterday. That seems to have died down. But the response by the Trump administration has been to bring in more ICE agents, bring in people, and knock on more doors. And because the standard for who gets to become an ICE agent has dropped, and the training time has dropped, and the bonus that you get by becoming an agent has increased. The number of people coming in who are less qualified, less well trained, and only sort of doing it for the money has increased. And, I think there is some correlation between the instability and the recklessness which some of the agents have shown to the fact that they're less well trained. They are don't have the same credentials as they used to have, and it is really sort of a recipe for further conflict. Bringing more in is likely, under the current practice, is likely to result in further conflict, further violence, and possibly the loss of life.
And in that context, James, how is the Trump administration justifying the deployment of more federal agents in these states, given what you just told us, and the allegations of unconstitutional stops, arrests, and racial profiling?
Yeah, I mean, basically, they are denying that it's racial profiling. And basically, what they're saying is regardless of the racial makeup, people who are in this country illegally need to be taken out. And so they would sort of have you believe that simply because you're here illegally, some of these rights don't apply to you. That is not the case. But what they're doing is doubling down in the hopes that they can just sort of ram through before any potential ruling that might possibly set them back on their goal of deporting as many people as possible. I mean, it's basically going into sort of fifth gear when, or, you're called in front of the school teacher. But, Charles, one of the challenges is the court system works so slowly. I know they've asked for expedited attention. The actual hearings, I don't think, are scheduled until next week. And it's very, very hard to see how any of this would slow down the Trump administration, which just wants to keep its pledge. Remember, Charles, immigration was the number one issue after the economy that got people to support President Trump. Given the challenges he's had in recent weeks related to affordability, the Venezuela invasion and occupation, pivoting back to immigration is a winning tool for the president, and doubling down on that, he thinks it's only going to continue to convince those who support him that he's doing exactly what he needs to do to support them.
And James, regarding the circumstances surrounding the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis, will the Department of Homeland Security be conducting an internal investigation into the incident?
Yeah, I mean, there are supposedly going to be an internal investigation. I think the big problem is the credibility of that investigation. So we know that there's an investigation of the actual killing, and that is being conducted by the FBI. What we don't know is who is actually going to review ICE actions and whether ICE will be given a chance to review its actions itself. I think one of the things that there's a real missed opportunity, not including the Minnesota State Police, not including the Minneapolis City Police, which would have at least given some outside voices to have a way to evaluate and to judge what actually went on. And in the absence of that type of extending the investigation to parties that are not involved, you really sort of lose the ability to kind of evaluate the killing independently. And that, I think, is a real loss. And I think that is something that a number of people are quite upset about, because it potentially gives the opportunity for someone to sort of get away with something because they weren't investigated properly or investigated independently.
James, thank you very much indeed. We are much obliged to you for helping us understand all this with considerable clarity. James Blue, Arise special correspondent, talking to me there from you.